Well, hello there and welcome to another episode of the Caregiver Cup podcast. My name is Kathy Vanden Heuvel here, and I am so glad you joined. Today, we are diving in to episode number 152, and it's all about the bone marrow transplant or the stem cell transplant process that my husband went through a year ago. And last week in episode 151, we talked about going to the doctor or the transplant doctor and having that first consult and making sure that it's a right fit for your loved one and they qualify for the transplant of their stem cells to go ahead and go through this process. Well, the next step that occurs is the transplant then gets scheduled, and you're in this phase where you're waiting a week or two and you're like, now what? Or better yet, what needs to get done before we go? And I'm referring to Dennis, my husband, who him and I had to go and leave our home and be within a 50-mile radius of the clinic and the hospital. And so we had to stay away from home and near the clinic for anywhere, a transplant patient, anywhere from 6 weeks to months on end. Ours was predicted to be 6 to 8 weeks, which was good because what he did is he got his own um, stem cells. They extracted the cells from his bone marrow because he had healthy bone marrow, and we could go ahead and I'm not a medical doctor here. We could go ahead and get him his bone marrow that was as much cancer free as possible, and they reharvest it and then they go ahead and put it back in a few weeks later. So we were lucky to do that. Some people have to go ahead and have stem cells donated from another donor that matches, and that takes a lot longer, the process, because there's a lot more chances where your loved one has complications, or it takes a lot longer to go ahead and take care of that. So before Dennis and I got home from the transplant, we were driving back from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and we live a little bit south of Green Bay, Wisconsin. And before we even got home, the transplant doctor had already scheduled the dates, and we were in the car and we were going ahead and going, oh my gosh, so what's next? What do we have to do? Remember when in last episode we talked about getting the binder and appointments starting to be scheduled, but we were in the car thinking, okay, where are we going to stay and how much is it going to cost? Is insurance going to cover everything, or what's our out of pocket? I was even going into these deep, dark places. It's like, are we going to lose our house? That sort of thing. Who's going to take care of the dogs and our house? And my mom, who I'm caregiving for, I'm sure my husband's mind was going even further, saying, is this going to work? You know, am I going to be okay? That kind of thing. And so that's such a stressful and emotional time for that. And so today in this episode, I want to share my experiences. I want to share the things that we did, the resources that we had, and then the things that we had to figure out on our own. And I also want to share the things that we had to learn from, we didn't do or we forgot to do, so that my hope is that you, if you're going through this process, can go ahead and take some of these ideas and thoughts, and it may even spark more. Now, if you're not a bone marrow transplant caregiver or a stem cell transplant caregiver, those terms are really kind of the same for Dennis, but they could be different in a little bit different way. But even if you're not, I think you're going to find some things here that are going to be applicable for you from a caregiver perspective. Because if you ever have to leave home for procedures or thinking about things, I think that's going to be the ticket for you to go ahead and do. So, I want to start out with the most overwhelming piece that took weeks to get through. Not saying that it took every ounce of my time, but it was things that just hung over my head for the longest of time. And that's all the paperwork and the forms that have to be filled out, the referrals that have to be done, the consents, and you're following up pretty much each and every day. And so I'm looking at my notes because I want to make sure that I kind of go through each one. We were lucky enough to have a transplant coordinator. Her name is Jeannie, and she took care of most of the stuff, but it still felt confusing because I really didn't understand what she was doing behind the scenes a lot. But once the doctor approves everything for your loved one to start the process, the doctor begins the consent process, and that kickstarts all of the other things like the housing and the insurance and all the appointments and all of that stuff. And the consent form also triggered, like I said in the last episode, it triggers all of these tests that have to be done. For example, he had to have lab work done, a COVID test, a pulmonary test, an EKG, an echocardiogram. He had to have his one line port taken out, and that's like it's usually in the chest area where they can go ahead and take blood out from the vein and they can do the IV chemotherapy. But they needed one that, oh, I don't remember what the official process is, but it's more structured and stronger. And it actually had three prongs or valves coming out of it so that they could go ahead and do all of the things that they needed to do. And so he had to have that surgery for that piece. He also had to have another round of chemotherapy and some injections to kickstart some of his bone marrow that way. And so the second round of consents are for then you had to have another set of consents once you started the bone marrow transplant process with that group of people. And then there was a third round of consents that had to be signed to go ahead and once they took out the stem cells to put them back in. And so, and I'm sure there was surgery ones and everything that had to be signed. So he was signing a lot of consent forms. And then the doctor had to go ahead and put in the referral process so that we could go ahead and qualify for the nonprofit place that we stayed, which was the housing that we stayed. The and that nonprofit organization was called Kathy's House, totally different than my name, but Kathy's House was named after gal named Kathy who had passed away from cancer, but realized that there were so many people in that she had met that the parents couldn't be there with the loved ones because they didn't have a place to stay in the area. And so she started up this nonprofit. But we had to go ahead and get the referral process so that they could look at to see if we qualified to stay at this place and then once they received the consent, then they would send over and they sent over the forms to me so that I could fill out the forms. And then, so we went back and forth with that process and being able to fill out the process. The doctor's consent also meant that the insurance company would get that pre authorization and get all of that stuff so we could kickstart that. And so we were waiting on the pre-approval process, I called and asked how we could speed up the process, um, what they needed. We ended up getting a great case manager. His name was Dave, and he was assigned to us. And just a little bit of tips for you as we were talking, and I was talking with Dave. I had asked him questions like, how much is it going to be covered? What's our out of pocket? Um, Can we go and get the pharmacy right in the clinic, or I have to find an in-network facility in Milwaukee because I did not want to drive back an hour and a half to Green Bay. And then I asked him about housing. Is there any coverage for housing? And what was really nice about that is they covered $50 a day for us for housing. And so when Kathy's house had asked on the form, what would you be willing to pay? It's absolutely free, but they always ask if you're willing to pay. And I said, well, we can pay $50 a day because that's what the insurance company will allow. So that was nice to be able to do that. And then I asked about, is there any other benefits that I can take advantage of during this process? And he talked about mileage. So, as an FYI for you, don't forget about just those things. And so, our mileage to and from was covered. Our housing, we were able to go ahead and give that gift to Kathy's house. So, it worked out really well. Also, my husband Dennis had other supplemental insurance. He had a cancer insurance plan. And so it required forms to fill out so that he could go ahead and get those benefits in per diem, per day benefits. And so I had to go to Jeannie and ask her if they could go ahead and have the doctor sign that. And so it just was a lot of it was a lot of requesting medical records and faxing forms and physician signatures and all of that. And I was so glad that I was able to do a lot of it from my house before we got there, but I was still following up when I got to Milwaukee for another couple weeks. And Kathy's house had a copy machine and a fax machine that we could use for free, or else I would be driving around trying to find it or asking the clinic if they could go ahead and fax it in. Then on top of that, I had my husband's disability because he was on short-term disability and he was going to during this process, he was going to have to flip over into long-term disability. And so paperwork needed to be filled out, signatures and medical records and faxing had to be done. Dennis did a lot of that himself, but he got everything and I would actually say, "Well, you're in there, I'll go back and go ahead and get these faxed." I had my own work disability forms that had to be filled out too. I was lucky enough to have a company that I worked for that had caregiver leave, but it required, you know what, all that paperwork that has to be filled out and signatures, and the doctor had to go ahead and do that. And so, one of the things that I got frustrated. I was ready to throw in the towel because you have all of these things that you're trying to follow up on. And naturally, you can't just say, okay, I'm going to take care of my disability, doctor sign it, get me the facts, get me the medical records. I'm going to fax them in. No, everything took like 5 to 10 days to 2 weeks because you were waiting for one or the other. And so there were many times where I just wanted to just freaking throw in the towel because it was just so much work and so much things to think about and remember. I remember myself taking just a basic, a Target spiral bound notebook, and on one page I would put, health insurance. The next page I would put cancer insurance, and as I got information, I would write it down on that page. And then each and every day I would have to follow up and go ahead and do that. So that's a tip. Another hack is when you had that spiral bound notebook, you had a point of contact at each of those places. So you weren't left to go ahead and figure it out or go through oh, you get transferred here to the next person to the next person. No, you had a point of contact like Dave at my husband's or at our health insurance company. We knew his personal number. We knew everything, where to look to see the progress, everything. So that was very clear. So, like, my husband had his HR contact and stuff. I ended up putting these people on my contacts in my phone so that I could follow up. Another tip is this is a lesson learned that I made wrong or I did wrong. is know where to go ahead and hand the paperwork to. Like, you have to get the doctor's signature or you have to request medical records, and you're right in the clinic for those most of the time. Who can I hand the paperwork to, or who can I send the paperwork to, and who can I follow up with? Because I made the mistake when we were like a week or two into it, where I was still following up with some things, and I just handed it to the nurse and I said, "Can you get this to Jeannie so that she can get doctor to go ahead and sign it?" Blah, blah, blah. Well, the nurses are so busy that the healthcare system is so busy that I know what happened. She put it on her her desk, came back to it, and probably forgot about it for hours and days, and I was still trying to hunt the paperwork down, and then I didn't have a copy myself, and I was freaking out, and we ended up finding it, but it ended up slowing the process down for a few more days. So, just kinda things like that. And, for the housing, once we got the housing, who's the point of contact? How can I ask the questions that I needed to ask? Which gets me into the next piece, which is the housing and arranging the housing. Like I said, the doctors go ahead and give the referral. Once the referral was done, we filled out the paperwork. Once the paperwork work was done, then we got online confirmation, and then we got all of the information, the rules, the resources, that sort of thing. But prior to that, I was like, okay, this is taking 3 or 4 days. What if we can't get this housing? Where are we going to go? And so I was researching backup plans. I was even researching like having a finding a home to rent for 2 months if I had to, because the hotel was just too risky. And so I was doing that. But eventually we got into Kathy's house, and I also researched ahead of time, went onto their website and looked at uh, pictures and stuff, which really helps me a lot. And I also went out to my Facebook page and just asked my friends, has anybody stayed at Kathy's house? Or do you know of anybody that stayed at this housing place? It was really good insights to get, because just like you and I, the facilities have a great overview and resources, and their website's good. But when you get down into the details, people can tell you a little bit more. And so, um, one of the things that I noticed on the website is they had refrigerators in the rooms, they had microwaves in the room, so it looked like a typical hotel room, which was good. And they had a lazy boy and a desk and two twin beds, and a nice bathroom and stuff like that. And I could see that they had a kitchen area, so we could not, with Dennis, he could not be exposed to somebody else cooking his food because of the chances of bacteria infection. We couldn't even go buy at the deli, so everything had to be cooked, canned, all that kind of stuff. And I'll get into future episodes on that so that you kind of know that. So, um, he was also in the rules list. He was required, and so was I. We were required before we drove in and got into Kathy's house. We had to have proof that we both had COVID testing done within 48 hours of arrival. We had to have a mask. And so all of that had to be prepared, because I loved it, because Kathy's house was all about safety, cleanliness, and peace of mind for all of the patients that were there, because most of them were immune compromised. And so, other things that went through my head though is like, what do I pack? What do I pack? It's not like you're packing for like a resort or a vacation. We laughed, we joked in the car, like we look like we're camping for 8 weeks, because we didn't know how long we were going to be there. But things like, do I need to bring towels and blankets and bedding and the kitchen supplies and all that kind of stuff? So I was back and forth emailing Kayla, and she was really good about it, and she provided me with a lot of answers. Um, One thing that I brought with me that I didn't need to bring, and this is just all good things that you want to ask, is I brought I brought toweling, I brought baby not baby wipes, Clorox wipes, hand sanitizer, all that kind of cleaning stuff, and I didn't need to do that. We found out when we got there all of those were supplied. I brought laundry soap because they had washers and dryers there. Found out that I didn't need that. So we donated a lot of things when we were there because I didn't want to bring it back. Um, but I also thought about before I went there, what things would Dennis need to feel more comfortable? What things do I need to kind of make it my own? So I have some really off the wall things, but I did. I brought my own coffee pot and coffee. Sure, they supplied it in the kitchen area, but I wanted to have my coffee pot in the room so I could continue to fill up my coffee, have my own brand of coffee. It made me feel better. I brought my NutriBullet so that I could make my green smoothie shakes and all of the fixings. I found out they had a NutriBullet there, so I could have saved my time there. We packed snacks. I even brought my computer and my um, podcasting gear with me, a dumbed down version of it, because I found out through Kayla they had really strong Wi-Fi. Dennis brought along his iPad so he could go ahead and read his books online. He could do his crossword puzzles, that kind of thing. But he also brought big puzzles that he could do in the room. And so we brought a card table with us so that he could, because he was confined to the room for the first few weeks where he couldn't leave. He actually qualified to do everything outpatient and he had no complications, but that meant he goes to the clinic and the hospital at 7 a.m. and then he returns later in the day and he has to go directly to the room. I have to do all the cooking and bring it back to the room. He has to avoid as much exposure as he possibly can and stay healthy. And so, um, other things that I read from Kathy's Household Resources, and I did a lot of researching online, is I brought things like Modian for diarrhea, Tums. I can't remember what they're for, but Tums helped in the process somewhere, I think with the bone marrow or something. Tylenol, Preparation H, that poor guy for the first few weeks. Chapstick, throat lozenges. We ended up buying, he had a pill box, but it was so small. We ended up, um, I ended up driving all over town to find a bigger pill box that had morning, noon, and night versus just one that he had. Nobody had it. So I ended up ordering it on Amazon and they delivered it there. So that was good. We had brought a thermometer along, just things like that. What do you need? Uh, what is in your medicine cabinet that you think you might need? Even myself, what do I need? What's by your nightstand and that you're using all the time? Then I had to think about how am I going to manage the home front? We're going to be away from home for 8 weeks, probably, on average 6 to 8 weeks. And so I had to figure out, you know, who was going to go ahead and take care of the snow shoveling and watch the house. And I have two big Labrador retrievers that needed to be watched. I have one that cannot be in a kennel because, or even in, doggy resort because he freaks out and has super anxiety with other dogs. And one time that we brought him, he came back and his paws were all bloody because he was running so hard to stay away from other dogs. And he's like this 70-pound big dog that looks mean and everything. So we couldn't. And so I did some research, was going to have somebody stay in the house and watch the dogs, but that was hugely expensive. So through discussion with my mom, who I caregive for, she said, Kathy, why don't I just stay at the house? I usually stay at my apartment and I'm pretty independent. I just need X, Y, and Z. And so we made the decision, and bless her heart, she stayed with my dogs. And then what I did behind the scenes is I made a calendar for every single day, and I had somebody stopping over every single day to check on her, to check on the dogs, to make sure the dogs didn't barrel over her. And so I have 3 boys, and so they did the snow blowing. Um, I had my girlfriend Julie come over. It was fun because they walked the dogs every day, that it was halfway decent outside. They brought over food for my mom, and then my brother was primary caregiver, so he did all the appointments and grocery shopping and doing anything mom needed to do. And having a ring camera on the front of your house, oh my gosh, because I could see people coming in each and every day, and I would take little screenshots and say thank you. And before we know it, people were like, hi, on the ring camera before they went into the house and visited my mom. And so another thing that worked really well for me is I knew my mom struggled with isolation and feeling depressed and lonely. And when she was at her senior apartment, she had friends and stuff that would come over and visit, and cards they would play and so on. At my house, she was just pretty much by herself. And so she would get a visitor every day. And then I said to mom, let's FaceTime every day after dinner. And so we FaceTimed every single day. What is it? 7 times 8 weeks, 7 times 6 weeks, at least 50 times. And so, which was really nice because I could give her updates. She could tell me what's going on. We could cry together. We could laugh together. And it was really nice to be able to have that. So you're so isolated as a caregiver and your loved one from everybody else. You can't leave, except for I left to run groceries and stuff, but you can't leave. You're really at the mercy of this disease and the whole transplant process. And so that was it. And then I kind of talked about caring for mom. We FaceTimed each night. My brother was the primary caregiver, which means he had to take mom to appointments, getting her hair done, going grocery shopping, and that sort of thing. And I would get notices on the computer. Thank goodness I have most everything electronically done. Her medication was ready. Her prescriptions were ready to be picked up. All I would have to do is say, John, take mom and go pick up her prescriptions before the end of the week. That kind of thing. I did most of her bills electronically. And then if something came in, we did it over FaceTime. And I went ahead and she told me what the amount is. I paid the bill. We were all set. And so there was only one time that I wanted to be at an appointment with her and my brother. And what was really nice is that we zoomed in. They zoomed me in on it, and I was able to go ahead and be present to ask because my mom had lung cancer. And I think that was the time it was starting to progress, unfortunately. And she passed away this year. But so, and then another major thing, and if you hold a job and you work besides this caregiver role that you're in, I had to figure out, okay, I need to be away from home. I was lucky enough to work from at home. Some people, you may work in an office, and I had to figure out, do I need to take off for those whole entire time, or can I work off site? And I was lucky enough, through discussion with my boss and my team and talking through my schedule, I was able to go ahead and work off site. And I actually shifted my hours so that I could go ahead and work early in the morning, bring Dennis in for his appointment and his stem cells and all of that kind of stuff. And then I would go ahead and finish up my day later when we got back into the room. They lightened my load. I had the luxury of that. But having all of those discussions are important, because if my employer would not have allowed me to do that, I would have had to take family medical leave and go ahead and qualify for that, more paperwork to be done. But I didn't have to do that. But I know a lot of my clients have had to do that. And So I also packed, but like I said, I packed my laptop, but I knew that if it was going to be this long, I needed my big monitor as well. And so here's Kathy packing it for her long trip. And yes, I packed my big monitor with me and put it on the desk because that was going to be something I knew that after a few days, it was going to be hard. What was even harder for me, just as a sidebar, I didn't pack my office chair. I sat on there like their hard wooden chair. It had a cushion on it, but the desk was so high and the chair was so low. I had backaches and yeah, so what did I do? I ended up ordering an office chair on Amazon. So I have 2 office chairs now, but I could not. I'm like, okay, after a few days, my back was sore, my neck was sore. I couldn't figure it out. And I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna have to bite the bullet and do that. Now, I could have probably asked the office if they had an extra chair for me, but I figured, well, I'll be fine getting my own, and so that was the big piece that I wish I would have thought through so that I could have. They had a beautiful library, they had great Wi-Fi, so and different working areas that I can sit and do some work as well. But I am so much a dedicated girl to my computer and my desk and my big monitor that very seldom do I leave this little cove that I'm in. Oh, so another couple of things though that I wanted to go ahead and share with you here once. I'll see if I can get this. Let me hide this once. A couple of things that I wanted to share with you that I didn't think about. I didn't think about at all was myself. What am I going to do when I'm there for my own self care, to go ahead and exercise, to eat healthy? Sure, I packed my NutriBullet, which was good. I packed my tennis shoes, which was good. But what was I going to do there? And I wish I would have put more thought into it. However, I learned as I went. I journaled and did things like that. But there's so many things that I could have done. And in an upcoming podcast, I'm going to spend an entire podcast about thinking through a strategy for yourself when you're away from home, because not only are you caring for your loved one, which is heavy and huge and really in depth, you have to take care of yourself too. And what does that look like? It doesn't look like the everyday caregiver situation. It doesn't look like your normal situation. It's different. For me too, Dennis was in isolation, and there so we couldn't do anything outside of the room, and so we couldn't have any visitors, and I never thought about the impact and the loneliness you feel when you can't leave. I know we were exposed to the pandemic, and that helped a little bit, but this was in one room. I don't know what the size of that room was, but think about you staying in a hotel room and you can't leave the hotel room at all, except for just to go to the kitchen to get something and you come back, except for when you drive to the clinic and you come back. You can't go anywhere. And so the impacts of that start wearing on you. And so even like on the drive down, I didn't think through on the drive down that he couldn't be exposed to any viruses, any crowds. And so we didn't stop unless it was absolutely necessary. And he never went to the bathroom in the restrooms. He just said, I'm just going to hold it until I get home because I don't want to be exposed. Well, Kathy here had to stop because she drinks too much coffee, but we couldn't stop and get food along the way. And so packing things and having those healthy snacks for him that are safe is so important. So those are just a couple of things. Uh, we had a couple weeks then to pull everything together, like I talked about. And as I thought through things, I would add them to my list and, just kind of doing that. But other things is when things came up, you have to think about like if you get your hair done. okay, my next appointment's going to be when I'm gone. So I had to go ahead and switch that. I had to change my dental appointment because I wouldn't be home. I went to the pharmacist and had to get extra prescriptions because I usually did the monthly refills for my own prescriptions and I was going to be away. So, what things do you need that you're going to have to pack for 8 weeks? And so just kind of things like that. So, and and then I brought along that list of follow-ups that I had to continuously do every day. So, as I conclude today, those were just a few of my thoughts. As I conclude today, I want to think about the place that you're staying. And I commend Freighter Hospital in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the transplant team for providing all the great resources for my husband, Dennis. That binder was stellar. It told him exactly what was going to happen, what was going to be done, how it was going to be handled, and it was a great resource for him, but there was very little information for me as a caregiver. And, as a caregiver advocate, having to go ahead and get all of the paperwork done and all of that. It was a full-time job to just keep track of all of that and do all of that. And then what things to pack and what things to bring along and what things to think about from a cooking perspective, because you only can pack so many meals with you in your cooler. And then when I got there, I was left to go ahead and saying, okay, where can I go ahead and get groceries that I feel comfortable going to and that I wouldn't be exposed to as many people as possible? No offense to Walmart, no offense to like the Targets, but those are big stores. And I didn't want to be in the stores during their busy times. And so I found grocery stores that were much quieter and I went grocery shopping off hours, and I had to go ahead, and I'll talk about this in probably the next episode. We met with a nutritionist of what he could eat and what he couldn't eat. And so I had to go ahead and do that. And then I'm a terrible cook, but I had to cook all the meals that way. So that's why I'm sharing this. This is the second in many series that I'm going to share about Dennis's stem cell transplant, because I know there are so many things that are never discussed or not brought up to you until they happen. And it's so important for us as caregivers to be equipped with so much information that we can go ahead and reduce that stress and that overwhelm that we feel. And so I feel like this is what I want to do from a give back perspective. But I bet even if you're not a caregiver today, I bet you found something that is going to be of benefit for you, because I'm going to share with you in the next episode, like what I brought with me to appointments, how I took care of the room each day, and I'm going to talk about like the day in the life of the stem cell transplant process. It was pretty intense, and then it got to be pretty boring doing the same thing every day, every day, every day. Dennis was done in 6 weeks, but it was pretty intense. And remember, he was outpatient. And so a lot of the heavy burden was on my shoulder. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Caregiver Cup podcast, episode 151, where we talked about the transplant is now scheduled. So now what do I have to do? As always, I would love to hear about your journey and your caregiving experience. You can find me on Instagram. It's right on the bottom of the screen at Kathy Lynn Van, or I have a Facebook page called the Caregiver Cup, or you can go ahead and snoop out onto my website at kathylvan.com. Yes, I couldn't get kathylinvan.com. It just drives me crazy, but there's somebody that's got it. So I had to be Kathy L. Van out there. So crazy world. But I hope you enjoyed it, and we will talk to you again next week. Bye for now.